Dan Clark Audio's new $4,000 stealth headphones were 4 years in the making, and they use some very advanced technology, something unique which has never before been seen in headphones. So not only will I take you through the technology that's in them, but I'll give you my impressions listening not only to the headphones themselves, but with a variety of different equipment and how they compare to a variety of other high-end headphones such as the ones behind me. So watch on to find out more. Before we start, please give me a moment to thank Headamp Electronics for sponsoring today's video. Headamp are the makers of the legendary Blue Hawaii electrostatic amplifier as well as the Gilmore series of amps. They also sell a full variety of high-end headphones and electronics, so you can buy a complete headphone system from them. As I was approaching the review of these headphones, it got me thinking about something which maybe people haven't really considered for some time. It's that what are headphones fundamentally for? If you think about it, headphones were originally conceived so that an individual could exclusively listen to something, and that something's not defined, where nobody else can hear them and only they hear what they need to listen to, whether it be someone's voice, for communications, or maybe in a situation where there's a lot of noise around. But in all those situations, fundamentally, headphones were closed back. That is, the sound only emanated from the part, where towards your ear, and it also isolated you from other sounds. So you can think about something like a pair of noise-cancelling headphones such as the Sony WM series. Really, they are the epitome of what headphones were designed for, in that they give you an exclusive listen to music or whatever it is, and you can't hear anything else around you, and other people can't hear what you're hearing. So when you think about it, that contrasts high-end headphones, which tend to be open-backed. And if you think about the diaphragm or the driver inside a pair of headphones is not only putting out noise towards your ears, but in both directions. And the thing is, as headphones become more and more high-end, the drivers to move faster and give a better sound quality have been made lighter and lighter and lighter, and to the point where the drivers in these stealths are lighter than the air that they're moving. Now, if you think about what's the effect of that, well, just take another pair of headphones, in this case a pair of Hi-Fi Man Arias. Now, these use a very light pair, very light drivers as well, and they are completely open-backed, so you can see the driver through here. So as much sound as goes out towards your ear also goes out in the other direction. So even when wearing them, everyone around you can hear what you're listening to. So then, and also I can hear, for example, there's a slight hiss of the air conditioner in the background or something like that. I can hear that clearly. So it's the drivers are so light, it has got to the point that if I'm listening to music and I put my hands even, say, this far out from the headphones, it'll affect the sound. I can hear the effect of the reflections off my hands and back onto the drivers, and that's how light the drivers have become. So as headphones have become more and more high-end, they tend to all be open-backed. So what happens if you want to make them closed back? Well, if you put these on and cover the drivers like this, it degrades the sound quality so significantly because of the reflections that it's just not going to work. And this is what Dan Clark encountered when he designed the stealths. Now, he wanted to make the Ether 2, which was their current open-back flagship, into a pair of closed-back headphones, but it just wasn't going to work. And so he started from scratch. And so when you enclose a pair of ultralight drivers, how do you do so and maintain sound quality? Now, something I'll give you a hint on, if you want to hear in detail about the design of these, Head-Fi's original interview with Dan Clark about the stealths, I recommend watching. It goes into a lot of more detail than I'll go here. I'm just going to give a summary of some of the bits that are in that video. Likewise, some of the discussion and some of the things I'm going to talk about can be found in Dan Clark's presentation at CanJam, where he talks about headphone measurements. And there's a lot of stuff in there. I'm going to give bits of that, but you'll find that video, which I'll also link to in the description, very enlightening if you want to get into the fine details. Now, if you've seen Dan Clark's headphones before, and I'm very experienced with them as well, you'll notice, of course, some similarities. Some of his designs are just remarkable and have kind of surprised other manufacturers with their ingenuity. You're starting with this nitinol wire headband. And nitinol wire, of course, if you're not familiar, is what's used in braces, if you have braces on your teeth, because it's a metal alloy that it can be heated up to a certain temperature, shaped, and then at normal room temperature, it will stay in its shape no matter how seriously you deform. It just will not deform, essentially. So it's a perfect material, and it's such a simple idea, and that's one of the remarkable things about this. Now, in prior headphone designs, such as the Ethers and the Eons, you had a sliding adjustment here. So in this case, he's eliminated the sliding adjustment and has put a high-quality elastic headband on here. So all you have to do is pop them on, and they're the right size. And maybe, if you have a very large head, the occasional person with certain head shapes has found that they pull up a little bit. The strength for me is about right to just, there's enough tension on there to hold them nicely in place. And being, of course, very lightweight, they are very comfortable. But the attention to detail, has got to the point where, well, they fold as well, like the Eon series. So you can pop them into a small case, which they come with, and they take up much less room than, other high-end headphones. Say, for example, I have the Elites behind me, and they're just not really portable. So it's kind of remarkable also that not only are these high-end headphones which can be used at home, but also you could call them portable high-end headphones if you want to carry around with you $4,000 pair of headphones, maybe if traveling. But in that, he's designed them to a degree of care and consideration to every little bit has been considered so carefully that he's even shaped them so that when you have them on your head, you can't see them. So there's nothing sticking out in your vision. But aside from that, we still have the same things as on other headphones. Now, I have an aftermarket cable on here, which I'll talk about in the review. We have the same Hirose connectors. These connectors are medical equipment connectors, and they're designed to be plugged and unplugged thousands of times. And my local kind of physiotherapy type clinic has equipment which use these connectors, and they plugging and unplugging them constantly. So they're a very reliable connector, even if they're not the most convenient, say like a 3.5 millimeter connector might be, but they have good contact, which is what's necessary. He's also focused very strongly on the quality of the ear pads. Now, when you say driver matching, he matches the individual drivers so that left and right are as close as possible. Something that will affect that in a negative way is imbalance between the left and right ear pads, and that's kind of can't be helped. Giving perfectly shaped ear pads is one of those challenges which Dan is still working on. But one thing he has talked about, which if you've had high-end headphones for some time, you'll find you have some old pair of headphones and the ear pads have become kind of floppy and deformed, and usually the memory foam that's in them will kind of end up looking lumpy and awful. He's worked on avoiding that happening with the ear pads that are in there. Now, the ear pads themselves there's a reasonable amount of depth in here, despite the one of the pieces of technology that's in here, which I'll talk about in a bit. So they are quite deep, plush, and they sit very comfortably on your head. So Dan recommends pulling them, forward and down, and it's very easy to do that. And being fairly narrow, they don't break seal quite as easily as maybe Sennheiser's HD820 do, which is a problem I had. But they still can break seal, which turns out to be a little bit of a critical issue because the clamp isn't super tight. And the clamping force will affect, of course, the sound. If they're super tight, then they will push the cups in more. And if they're super loose, you can break seal easily. And I find that if you keep still, they don't break seal, but sometimes I can move my jaw and break the seal in listening. The next thing is Dan Clark's new AMTS system. If Dan had told me years ago that he's going to put something in between the driver and your ear, I would be kind of dubious, as you kind of think that something between the driver and your ear would have a negative impact on the sound. But this thing is quite genius. And to explain why, I'm going to have to divert to outside the headphone world. Now, if you're listening to me speaking here, I've got the microphone as close as possible to my mouth without you actually being able to see it. It's just like a tiny bit off camera. And the reason is, if I move away from the microphone, you're going to start hearing not just my voice, but the echo of my voice off the surrounding room. And that is, well, if you watch Dan Clark's CanJam presentation, his voice very much echoes off everything in that room. And something we don't consider so much is that sounds we hear are, we don't just hear, say someone speaking, but we're actually hearing reflections off everything around us as well. And we get so used to it, we kind of just tune it out. And it's more noticeable in something where, say, that video of Dan Clark at CanJam, because it's a very echoey room. Now, if you're into speaker systems, you may be familiar with the effect of putting a speaker inside a room, and not only does the speaker, broadcast sound towards you, but it starts, bass reflects off everything around, and a lot of speakers can end up becoming very boomy inside most rooms. So, for example, the speakers in my room, I have, one in front of a bookshelf, and the second one was in front of a corner where there was nothing at all, but it was a very narrow corner with a cupboard next to it, and I noticed that the bass was very boomy. So I had to actually hunt around till I could find a bookshelf small enough to fit in the gap. When I finally did, I put boxes on top of it and made it a homemade, kind of quick DIY bass trap, and the sound improvement was very noticeable. But it's a problem that happens in high-end audio, and audio in general, where speakers are involved, in that room setup becomes critical and how sound bounces off objects in the room, and that affects how the sound quality in there. So room speaker positioning and the timing of sound bouncing off things can be very critical, and people will pay a lot of money for damping materials and things to reduce the number of reflections inside a room to the point of, well, ridiculousness. You can spend thousands and thousands of dollars on room treatment. Now, of course, I'm not going to do that, and of course, kludges like sticking bookshelves in critical places does help a lot. But it's a very important thing because the Dan Clark Audio Stealths are designed with that in mind, and that's where the AMTS technology comes in. Now, Dan Clark follows the Harman curve system, and the Harman curve requires a little bit of discussion. And again, check out Dan Clark's measurement presentation video to understand it better. But in summary, the idea of the Harman curve was designed to emulate, flat speaker response in a well-damped room, but in headphones, as close as reasonably possible, considering that everyone's ears are different. And people are a little bit confused about this, and sometimes a little bit unnecessarily fanatical about it, as it's not like this is the best and everything else is wrong. It's more so this was a particular ideal, and if people want to have that ideal, they might aim for using it in their headphones. So, of course, you have other headphones such as Odyssey's LCD5s, which I'll talk about in comparison later, and that they were designed with a different goal in mind. So don't ever get the idea that one idea is right or one idea is wrong. Dan Clark focused on the Harman system because that's what he wanted to emulate. Now the problem with that is, for example, you may have a pair of headphones that measure, well, technically flat. Now how do you measure the frequency response of headphones? Well, you run a sweep from 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz through, and you measure the level as that goes along. Now, that doesn't account for the fact that music, when it's playing, you have multiple frequencies interacting there, and you may get all sorts of effects as the different parts of the headphone reflect sounds and sounds interact. And so you may have a pair of headphones. For example, the pair of Meze Elites sitting behind me, I have a graph from Meze, which unfortunately I promised not to show anyone, and that shows essentially a flat measurement curve from them. So they essentially measure flat. Yet if you listen to a pair of Meze Elites, they do sound like they have more bass than a flat measurement would suggest. Now, I don't have the details of the measurements as to why they measure flat on their particular rig. What's going on in there if it measures flat but doesn't sound flat? And that's where the reflections come in. And if you have, like with the speakers in my room, if you don't have things perfectly damped, there's going to be some bass boom coming through. And if I start listening to music in my room and I move closer to the speakers, then I notice there's more bass. And that's designed, again, with how the bass frequencies interact with my room. Now, the thing is with the AMTS system, if you think about the best example I can think of, if you think about a concert hall. Now, concert halls are specifically designed, if you do an image search now for concert halls, you'll see all sorts of acoustic designs in there, designed to direct the sound from the stage to the audience in a particular way. And this is very critical. It's not just reflecting sound or controlling the reflections of the sound in how they're directed, but also in how the walls don't over-reflect the sound and it doesn't become all congested. So if you've ever been to, say, a band, like in a small bar in a small location where there isn't a lot of damping, you'll hear it's kind of very loud and it's kind of all jumbled together. The sounds are all jumbled together, and you're actually hearing a lot of reflections off the venue. Whereas in a good concert hall, some of the designs have got quite sophisticated to the point where I've seen, and I regret I can't find where I had the link to this, someone designed a concert hall where it seems to have very thin slots in the wall, but inside those slots are special resonance chambers designed to absorb particular frequencies so they don't over-reflect inside the hall itself. Now, I remember the first time I went into a recording studio that had what perf board walls or perforated walls, those the boards which just have lots of holes in them. And I noticed suddenly that the sound was very different. It's like when I was speaking, the reflections were much far lower, and it sounded really different. It was a really weird experience. As a child, I was in a choir at the time, and we were practicing sometimes in this studio, and the experience was very different. Likewise, if you go to an acoustic chamber used for testing, and I been into one for a manufacturer's speaking testing chamber with all reflections damped, it is a very, very weird experience where if someone speaks to you directly, you can hear them, but if they speak away from you, it's like all the sound disappears. It's very, very strange. And so you realize how much reflections you get used to hearing reflections. Reflections from from objects around you, from the room around you, from when you have speaker placement, from headphones. Reflections make up a lot more of the sound than we may realize. So the aim of the AMTS system in the Dan Clark audio headphones is designed to damp that out so that you just get the actual music. And the effect of harmonics inside headphones can make it seem like there's more detail than there really is, or more of particularly frequencies, especially the bass frequencies, than there really are. And in negative terms, in some headphones I reviewed, such as the original Sony MDR R7s, it produced a kind of harshness that, in the higher frequencies in the mid-range, which when I did some experimental damping and modding, it actually reduced that reflections and actually improved the sound quality. Now, the AMTS system is something we've seen something similar to before, although not anywhere near as sophisticated. When Sennheiser made their HD800S headphones, they put in a small device inside the center of the hole in the driver, remembering that it is a ring driver with a hole in the center. And that was called a Helmholtz resonator. And that was designed to damp certain frequencies so that they weren't as strong, because we all know the original HD800s had the frequencies around the 6 kilohertz mark were a little bit too strong. And now what the AMTS system does is it uses multiple different dampers inside this array, so that if you actually shine a torch on the AMTS system, you'll see that some are passed through, that is, the sound comes through from the driver, and some are closed off, and they're obviously certain lengths designed to damp certain frequencies. And so the effect is very interesting. It's like when you listen, the effect on the sound is rather unusual, because the way the stealth measures and the way it sounds is somewhat radically different. Being closed back headphones, there are a number of factors that influence the stealth, but not just the fact that they are closed back, but how the AMTS system affects the sound. And all of those combined can and do seem to have confused a number of people online. Now, to start with, because they're closed back, they require a good seal to be effective. And one of the issues that came up actually when Stefan came round, if you saw the last, he was no longer a non-audiophile, but his last set of impressions of headphones, including the Stealth, he put them on and he had glasses on at the time, and it broke the seal. So one of the things I noticed is that they could very easily break seal, even if you just move your jaw. But not being so wide, such as the HD820s are, it's not quite so bad, although they're not the kind of headphone you really want to be doing the air guitar work with. But in terms of fit, they fit very comfortably and lightly and sit on your head with a soft clamp and with reasonably firm pads. That's something else that had an effect, and I'm kind of glad that I didn't review these headphones soon after I got them, as one of the other factors that came up was how the pads affect the sound. Dan recommends that you put them on forward and down and forward on your ears for best results. Now you can see his measurements video where he talks about that and talks about the effect of positioning and how sound hits the ear for more information about that. But the other thing we talk about is pads, and one of those dreaded terms in audiophile discussion is burn-in. Now, one of the things that somebody noticed is that after some time with the Stealth, that the pads soften up slightly. Now, when I first got them, I felt like they were very, I would suppose the description would be kind of lighter or thinner sounding, and there wasn't as much bass presence as I would have liked. And there were a number of factors to this, all of them combined. Now, the first one is the pads were pretty stiff, so I felt initially that I wanted to push the cups in more towards my ears to increase the bass response slightly. And after some use, I think the pads have softened slightly and the bass response has increased a little bit. And it can be confusing because a lot of people have graphs out there, and I'm just using Critical as one example, that show they have an increase in the bass as you get down towards 20 hertz. So you hit this slope up. Now, and one of the reasons, and this is a perfect example of why you can't read graphs and just say, oh, okay, this has a lot of bass or doesn't have a lot of bass. As what I talked about before, a lot of bass that we hear in headphones is not actually from the driver, but reflected off inside. So it's resonance. Now, with the resonances all damped, even though the graphs may say they look like they have a lot of bass, actually they don't sound that way. They sound initially bass light. But even after, once the pads have softened up, compared to other headphones primarily, they don't seem so like bass heavy, but they do follow the, as we've discussed before, the Harman target curve, which is designed to emulate high-end speakers in a pretty well-damped room. The only thing that Dan has added back is because the damping is so effective in these and removes so many of the resonances, especially those in the mid-bass, that he has added back a tiny bit of mid-bass in there just to give the effect of, well, if you imagine if you've been in a perfectly damped high-end room with, say, a pair of Wilson sashes, which are supposed to be, dead flat sounding, then it can sound rather boring. And so a little bit of resonance is always good. So instead of adding resonance back, he's added a little bit of a tiny bit of mid-bass hump in there. And you'll see that in graphs from various people. Now, if you compare, for example, the Elites sitting behind me, they kind of technically will measure flat. Now, if you think how a frequency response curve is generated, basically a sweep is passed through the headphone going from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and the response at each frequency is measured. So that won't quite account for resonances that you get when you're playing music. So even though the graph shows a flat frequency response, once you actually start playing music, they'll sound a little bit boomy, and they sound like they have more bass than they really do because of resonances inside the cups. Whereas actually the Stealth has more bass than the Elite, but doesn't sound like it does. So that gets really confusing, doesn't it? And it's like, again, the speakers in my room where before I put in the extra shelf for damping, it sounded kind of boomy and like there was more bass, but I knew that putting that shelf in and damping some of that bass would actually lower the amount of perceived bass, even though the amount of bass from the speakers themselves hadn't changed. It's the same thing going on in here. But the effect of the AMTS system runs through the whole frequency range. One of the probably negative effects, which is probably something I should talk about more in the gear section, is that I guess it causes them to become less sensitive as headphones than other headphones. So it means you have to turn the volume up louder, which means you have to push the amount of power up from the amp, and will both at the same time. And so, for example, on the Chord TT2 behind me, I can actually, with classical music, say some of the Chesky classical music, can very easily hit 0 dB. Well, not the actual maximum the TT2 can deliver, but what would actually be blowing your ears out with other headphones. So when you combine classical and a lot of amplification, you end up turning the volume up quite loud. So for example, the volume level at low gain on the R27HE, which is just out of shot, was something like in low gain, 77, in the 70s out of 99, and that's low gain, I should point out. Whereas it was kind of an extreme opposite example is just out of shot, the LCDRs, which are very sensitive, had the level down at about 30. So in the extreme, they're more towards the Susvara end of, they're not Susvara demanding, but you are turning the volume up and you do require good amplification components. Now the music impressions I am going to write up and put on my review on here.audio, so you can read all of those there. If I read them out, it will take me like 15 minutes. So I want to talk about the primary, a kind of summary of my impressions with music. Now, in listening, once I got a good seal going there and everything positioned nicely out of the TT2 or the Studio 6, I found that these were extremely sensitive to, well, everything. They were kind of brutally revealing, and not brutally revealing as in being sharp in the treble or sharp in the mids or having anything that any irritation became an irritation. They they do have a very low distortion sound, which is measurably lower than some amplifiers even. And I found that changes such as, I just happened for convenience to have an aftermarket cable on here, every little change I made to anything was very noticeable. And most so in the music, where I picked up a lot of detail. And I know that horrible audiophile cliche that goes, oh, I heard stuff in the music I never heard before. Well, I did in at least one track, actually from Massive Attack. One of my favorite tracks is Paradise Circus. And in that, actually, Massive Attack is recorded and mastered very well, and there's quite a bit of detail in there. And I recall the first time way back when I heard Massive Attack, not out of just the cheap stereo I had, but out of actually a real hi-fi system, and I was so surprised at the amount of detail in the music and how different it sounded. Paradise Circus is one of those tracks I've listened to so many times through so many headphones, and to hear even another layer of detail in that was pretty surprising. So these are definitely up there in terms of sound quality. I don't want to say electrostatic sound quality, because electrostatic sound quality is different. And I can't say it's necessarily better or worse, but it does always sound like, electrostats always sound like they have more detail. But I mean, these scale up in terms of what they can resolve very readily. And on the other hand, if your gear or music isn't so good, they're going to reveal it. But in terms of sound balance overall, initially, as I said, they kind of sound thin, so they don't have that kind of mid-bass bloom you get in headphones. Again, the damping system, the AMTS, has knocked a lot of that out. So initially, they can sound a little bit thinner, and you don't feel like there's a whole lot of bass, again, that system again. But at the same time, the treble isn't super peaky. Now, if you compare, for example, to the Hi-Fi Man Arias and other Hi-Fi Man headphones, they tend to have a very bright, exciting sound to them, which initially sounds really great, but after some time can be fatiguing. So for example, on some classical tracks, someone pointed out that trumpets can become a little bit overwhelming with something like the Arias, which I have behind me for review. But with the Stealth, that doesn't happen. The treble doesn't have that kind of artificial brightness a lot of headphones have. It has a kind of brightness that's closer to what you'd more realistically hear in, say, an actual classical concert, which isn't as bright as maybe most people imagine. So initially they do sound a little bit rolled off in the treble, but after a while you realize, well, that's actually what the music sounds like, and that you've been used to that kind of bright treble that you get from other headphones, which have it a little bit artificially boosted. And of course, because the AMTS system is knocking out any resonance and other distortion in there, if you listen into the details like I did with Massive Attack, and you can hear this, of course, on classical and other well-recorded music, you can hear well into the details of things like a highly experienced, say, violin player could probably make out the kind of bow and violin being played very readily. Compared to other headphones, though, I think one of the most asked comparisons is with the LCD5s, and you can see the review of these separately. Now, the LCD5s are, of course, tuned more for studio use. Now, in that, the tuning is, I mean, when people argue about what's the best tuning, and remember the goal of the LCD5s and the goal of the Stealth are different, and that's something to consider very carefully. Now, with the LCD5s, while they don't sound like typical Odyssey headphones, they do have a maybe slightly warmer or thicker mid-range, so vocals sound a little bit kind of darker and thicker than with the Stealth. But mid-range comes through maybe slightly more forward. Now, the LCD5s have that beautiful spherical kind of soundstage, which isn't super huge, but is kind of very well defined in 3 dimensions. Whereas the Stealth sounds a little bit more, well, kind of like the shape of the cups. It seems sometimes with music, well, have that lighter mid-range, and it still has a remarkable amount of kind of spaciousness for a pair of closed-back headphones. I did find that I was hitting kind of the limit of what you can do with closed-back headphones, excepting the HD820, where sometimes things, like if music became congested, sometimes things became maybe a little bit closed in for preference. An interesting track I was listening to from the Gotan project, that's very interesting music by French artists who are doing Argentinian tango music. It's one of those French things, you got to go listen to it, it's like, yeah, okay. I'm not going to try and pronounce the track, as if I try and pronounce Spanish, I've already got in trouble with at least one person for trying to pronounce names in Spanish, so I'll just put it on screen and in the description. In this track, you have music playing. In the back, they have a dog barking. And in most headphones, say the Final D8000 Pros, for example, the dog is way out there. And you can hear it, way out there in most headphones. But with the Stealths, it didn't sound way out there like it should. It sounded a little part, kind of like almost part of the blob of the music in there. And that was maybe a little bit of a disappointment. Now, in terms of, speaking of soundstage, initially you think these don't really sound closed back. They sound kind of more open and spacious. But it does very much depend again on how complex the music is. More complex music, I felt that it started to hit a bit of a limit. Unlike the anomaly that the Sennheiser HD820s are, where they absolutely don't sound like closed-back headphones at all. They sound wide, spacious, and open. Maybe artificially so, as the Sennheiser, the HD800 series, have always sounded artificially wide to some degree. The Stealth are not going to get anywhere near that, and they do sound more closed in after listening to the HD820. But all the same, they don't sound like closed in. But I'd say that the soundstage kind of evenness maybe has some imperfections in there. In less complex music, you can hear things very clearly. In some, I was listening to, for example, a track called "The Girl from Guatemala," which is on the David Chesky's Spanish Poems album, and it's a very bizarre album where he's taken literally Spanish poems and put them to music. And "The Girl from Guatemala," I think, is gloriously weird. It's a fantastic track, and but I think that particular recording is not one of my favorites in terms of like quality, because the vocals become very overwhelming, and that's something that would normally overwhelm something like the LCD5s, which are very mid-forward, but you still get, you hear that the vocals are maybe more mid-forward than are ideal, but it doesn't overwhelm things totally, whereas it does seem to overwhelm the Stealth to some degree, and it becomes too much, with those vocals seeming like they're clipping. I actually thought one day, I found it really irritating, and I thought maybe my ears that particular day were oversensitive. But listening back again now, I think it's also the recording too. And that just maybe was too much for these headphones. But that is maybe also a penalty of the fact that they do reveal everything in the music. And if you do have poor recordings, you're really going to hear how poor they are through the Stealth. They really are best out of, again, great gear with great quality recordings for best results. And usually most of the Chesky stuff has a really good dollop of bass that comes out really nicely through these, and it makes listening really fantastic. Compared to something like, say, the D8000 Pro. Now, the D8000 Pro maybe sound more spacious with the vocals further back and instruments slightly further back, less intimacy than you do get with something like these or the LCD5s, and maybe the sound is a little bit more left and right. And the thing that it seems like it's easier to listen to a lot of music with, as the D8000 Pros are more forgiving, but they do sacrifice timbre slightly. And I'd say listening to all those three pairs of headphones, the Stealth, the LCD5s, and the D8000 Pros, between all of them, I'd say that the Stealth wins on timbre, just has the edge over the LCD5s, which are a step up again from the D8000 Pros, which in exchange for that kind of spaciousness and that less intimate sound, and easier going sound, instrument timbre maybe not quite as good. And we're talking the difference between very good and excellent, or excellent and outstanding, if you take the Stealths as maybe the epitome example. But listening with the Stealths was kind of like listening with, like the TT2 and M scaler at first. It sometimes doesn't sound as, engaging or thick, and sometimes like I prefer them out of the Studio 6, much like I preferred the LCD5s out of the Studio 6, because it adds a little bit of harmonic richness back in there. Now, there's the trend towards criticizing harmonic distortion, and if I just divert for a second, there are two kinds of distortion. There's harmonic, which means that, say, you have distortion that's in harmony. You have a 1 kilohertz tone that produces a bit of a 2 kilohertz, 4 kilohertz, 8 kilohertz. It's harmonic. It's what you get, this harmonic richness. And a lot of studios in mastering add that in there to make the music sound more engaging. It's the reason sometimes people buy tube amps, because the harmonics which are added by the tubes, or actually by the circuit, it's not necessarily the tubes, does make it sound a little bit more kind of pleasant. And that's not a bad thing. And fighting it, we've seen a lot of, cheap Chinese amp manufacturers, say, oh, look how low our T8 harmonic distortion is. But harmonic distortion is the nice distortion which sounds good. And then you look at the other graphs which they don't talk about, the very high intermodulation distortion, which is the bad distortion that sounds bad. And eliminating too much of everything while eliminating too much of everything can make things sound a little bit too clinical, just as I had talked about in the LCD5 reviews, whereas I really prefer the LCD5s with a little bit of harmonic distortion added back in. The stealth maybe for some people maybe too much of a perfect thing. But the good thing is with these you have the choice about how much harmonic richness you add in through ancillary equipment, whereas say you get what you get with whatever distortion is in something like the Elites or the Empyrean or other headphones which do have some cup resonance in there, and all headphones will have some to some degree. Now, in terms of gear driving, interesting question somebody asked, and I happen to have it still on hand, is can you drive them out of a FIO Q5S? You can, but I wouldn't recommend doing so. I could really hear how flat kind of the digital section of this sounded. I mean, you can, if you don't listen loud, drive it out of portable gear such as this, but you're going to lose maybe a lot of the dynamic ability of these headphones. You're going to lose a lot of the detail. It's not going to sound anywhere near as good. Driving it out of portable gear, I mean, to give you an example of where it kind of scales up, if you saw that video with Stefan, he plugged the Stealth into Cayenne's N8 Mark II, which otherwise drives full-sized headphones reasonably well, actually really well for a portable device. But he'd still jumped up a level when he plugged it into FIO's M17, which was in DC power mode, which effectively gives it the power output and ability of a full desktop system. And so in that, they're still very insensitive headphones which require a lot of power for best results, and you can very easily make equipment clip with them, especially portable gear. I mean, I could drive them out of a Mojo or Mojo 2 easily, but if you start getting up loud, then either the gear starts to get very shouty if it actually doesn't have real power drive behind it, just, maximum output is just a number, or you will actually hit clipping with them. So that's probably the main thing, is that they really do scale up to the best that you can provide, and I can't say I recommend portable gear with them. If you do, I mean, stuff like IFI's IDSD Diablo, which I have here, will power them, especially in full output mode and full turbo mode. And with the latest firmware, which I just put in there, actually sounds pretty good with them. But you're going to be going for stuff like that for best results with them, and you're still not going to get maybe the level of detail retrieval these are capable of. But if you do buy a pair of these and you have them at home in a main system, and you do take them on the go, and you don't mind sacrificing a little bit of their capability, then, well, something like a Diablo or maybe a Mojo 2 or a Hugo 2 absolutely powers them very well, and is probably one of the most ideal setups for them, probably about the most resolving you can get in terms of transportable or portable systems. Or something like an FIO M17 does really well with the stuff that actually can deliver serious power. So as meeting the epitome of what headphones are, and also meeting the ideal of the excellent pair of high-end headphones, the great all-rounders that do everything, I'd say Dan Clark has done an outstanding job. I mean, 4 years of effort. And again, go and watch those videos from HeadFi and Dan Clark's presentation to understand a lot more detail. Now, will you like them if you buy them? Well, that's a tricky thing, and you'll see people online who absolutely don't like them and prefer more kind of harmonically rich headphones which have more going on in the sound. And on the other hand, you'll find people who do like hearing into the fine detail of the music, and I like both actually. I kind of enjoy both. And so hearing really far into the music you can do with a Stealth, maybe with the only caveat that very complex music can be maybe a little overwhelming for them for preference, and it won't have the kind of super wide soundstage that you may feel you get with other headphones. And they are not forgiving at all on the quality of your music, the quality of your gear, the quality of everything basically. So if you do have any distortion in your system, you're really going to know it. Before you go, if you're watching this, do you have a pair, or have you tried a pair of the DCA Stealth? Do leave a comment below and leave your thoughts. They are most welcome. As I always say, don't just take my word for stuff. It's nice if other owners can put in their kind of proverbial 2 cents, and so that helps people out who are making the decision whether to buy them or not. So as always, thanks once again for watching. Don't forget to check out the written review when it appears on here.audio, and I look forward to seeing you online.